After World War II, thousands of tons of gold disappeared, not destroyed, not returned, just gone. Gold has never been merely a mineral. It has always been something more. For thousands of years it has been the foundation of empires, the silent witness to the greatest crimes in history, and the ultimate store of value. In the chaos that followed the Second World War, perhaps more gold changed hands secretly than at any other time in history. Gold belonging to governments, central banks, occupied nations, and ordinary people was poured into vaults whose existence could not be officially acknowledged. The war ended with military victories, but in the shadows of diplomacy and finance, the winners were often those who could move wealth without leaving any trace. This situation is actually the story of how the world's most trusted form of money was smuggled, stolen, laundered, and kept hidden. At the same time, it is also the story of why some portion of that gold may still be missing. To understand how such a large quantity of gold could disappear, it is necessary to remember and recall what gold represented in the early 20th century. Before the war, the vast majority of the world's currencies were backed by gold reserves. Central banks saw it as the ultimate guarantee for their paper money and accumulated it. For all nations, gold essentially meant credibility. In the late 1930s, tensions in Europe began to rise, and some governments fearing invasion started moving their reserves abroad. The Netherlands quietly sent more than 100 tons of gold to Britain, Canada, and the United States. Belgium transferred hundreds of tons of gold to locations considered safe, or at least believed to be safe. When the Nazis advanced in 1940, they quickly moved to seize the reserves of the countries they occupied. Gold did not only mean loot, it also served as a tool for financing the war. Nazi Germany used the gold it captured to purchase critical war materials, especially from Switzerland. Swiss banks, meanwhile, were more than willing to accept this gold without asking too many questions. One of the most famous examples was Belgium's gold. Before the occupation, Belgium had sent its 198 tons of gold reserves to the Bank of France for safekeeping. When France fell, the gold was sent to the port of Dakar in West Africa, which was under the control of the Vichy administration, supposedly for protection. From there, it quietly fell into the hands of the Reichsbank and effectively helped finance the Nazi war economy. Some countries tried to act even more cautiously. Anticipating invasion, Poland carried out a remarkably daring evacuation operation, transporting its gold reserves through Romania and Turkey, and eventually to the United States and Canada. Nevertheless, a large amount of gold in the occupied territories fell into Nazi hands. Much of this gold was melted down, recast, and stripped of identifying marks in order to conceal its origin. However, Nazi plunder was only one part of the story. As the war dragged on, the Japanese Empire was also carrying out its own looting operations in Asia. In occupied China, Southeast Asia, and the Philippines, the Japanese military seized gold, silver, precious stones, and cultural treasures. In post-war accounts, these were often referred to as part of the so-called Golden Lily operation. It was claimed that these treasures were hidden in secret vaults and tunnels, especially in the Philippines, in order to be retrieved after the war. Although some of these stories have come to sound like legends over time, there is credible evidence that significant quantities of precious metals were indeed hidden and were never officially recovered. Just as in Europe, the line between military conquest and organized crime had become increasingly blurred. By 1945, as Allied forces continued advancing, both German and Japanese authorities attempted to move or hide whatever they could carry. The Allies captured part of it. The program of the U.S. Army, known as Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives, uncovered not only stolen artworks, but also enormous caches of gold stored in salt mines and hidden depots. One of the most famous discoveries took place in the Merkers salt mine in Germany. American forces found perhaps more than 100 tons of gold bars, coins, and banknotes there, along with extremely valuable works of art. However, the gold discovered there represented only a small portion of the total that had been taken. Much of the rest had already disappeared, traded through neutral banks, laundered, or buried in locations still unknown. At this point, the story begins to shift from wartime plunder to post-war geopolitics. The aftermath of the war had become extremely chaotic. Europe had turned into ruins, borders were changing, and the Cold War was beginning to take shape. This environment was extremely favorable for vast amounts of unaccounted wealth to be absorbed into new power structures. In 1946, the Allies established the Tripartite Gold Commission in order to return recovered gold to the countries from which it had been stolen. Over the years, this commission processed approximately 336 tons of gold. However, compared with the thousands of tons believed to have been seized during the war, this amount was quite small. The remaining gold disappeared into private vaults, undisclosed state reserves, or financial networks spanning continents. One of the most controversial aspects of this period was the role of neutral countries, particularly Switzerland. The Swiss National Bank and private banks purchased hundreds of millions of dollars worth of gold from Nazi Germany during the war. A portion of this gold had been looted from occupied countries and even from individuals who had perished in the Holocaust. Historical investigations conducted in the late 1990s confirmed that Swiss banks had dealt in stolen gold and in many cases maintained secrecy even after the war ended. Similar accusations were directed at banks in Portugal, Spain, Sweden, and Turkey, which had acted as intermediaries in the wartime flows of gold. The years after the war also witnessed the rise of covert intelligence operations funded partly through assets that were difficult to trace. In a world divided between East and West, access to gold that could not be tied to official records was extremely valuable. According to some claims, a portion of the missing wartime gold was used to finance anti-communist operations, support certain political parties, or stabilize friendly regimes in Europe and Asia. In this context, the gold did not simply disappear. It became part of the machinery of a new type of global conflict, one conducted through espionage, propaganda, and economic pressure. By the 1950s and 1960s, the world had moved toward increasingly complex financial systems. Nevertheless, gold remained at the center of international payments under the Bretton Woods system. Officially, gold prices were fixed and reserves were declared. Unofficially, it was possible that some countries held more gold than they admitted, or that some of the gold in official vaults had a darker past. Countries such as the United States and the United Kingdom, which had accepted large quantities of gold during the war years, incorporated it into their reserves. However, there was no public discussion about the origins of this gold. For nations rebuilding their economies, the question of whether the gold in their vaults had once belonged to someone else was often ignored in the interest of stability. And yet the mystery continued. Even today, researchers, treasure hunters, and governments occasionally announce new discoveries. A buried treasure in a forest, a train filled with valuables allegedly hidden in a mountain tunnel, or a shipwreck carrying gold bars intended for wartime payments. Although many of these claims turn out to be exaggerated or false, some of them are real. The historical record is clear. Between 1939 and 1945, enormous quantities of gold disappeared, and a significant portion of it has never been officially recovered. From a financial perspective, this represents billions of dollars in today's value. From a symbolic perspective, it serves as a reminder of how quickly the rules of property and morality can be suspended in times of crisis. When viewed from a modern perspective, the connection to this story lies less in the specific gold bars that vanished and more in the mechanisms of disappearance. The Second World War demonstrated how quickly wealth can be moved, hidden, and transformed when powerful actors decide that the normal rules no longer apply. The very same techniques, moving assets across borders, laundering them through intermediary institutions, concealing ownership through shell structures, are still used today, and not only by governments but also by corporations and individuals. In times of financial crisis, assets do not simply vanish. More often, they reappear in the hands of those capable of hiding them. For investors, the lesson is clear. Gold may feel like the safest asset, resistant to inflation, political turmoil, or currency collapse. However, its safety ultimately depends on where it is stored and who controls it. In wartime Europe, holding gold in your country's central bank provided no protection if an invading army could seize it overnight. In peacetime, keeping physical gold in a country that might later change its laws or freeze foreign accounts can be just as risky. The disappearance of gold after the Second World War is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a case study of how wealth can vanish in an environment of chaos. The lesson drawn by financial historians is very simple. History does not repeat exactly, but it rhymes. When global systems come under pressure because of war, economic collapse, or geopolitical rivalry, the line between legal transfer and outright theft becomes extremely thin. The missing gold of the post-war years is proof of how fragile financial security can become when the world is turned upside down. In today's world of digital money, cryptocurrencies, and shifting geopolitical alliances, the real question is no longer whether wealth can disappear. The question is how quickly it can happen, and whether it will occur before you even notice it. Understanding these patterns is not only financial education, it is also a form of self-defense.